Hey, Becky.
Hello.
Daniel?
Yeah, I'm here.
No, good. I think what we'll do, Daniel, is we'll leave it for a little bit longer so that people typically try and log in at 11 o'clock. So it's a lot of people are jumping on very quickly now. So we probably want to leave it go for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Okay, sure.
Becky?
Yes, thank you.
No problem.
I want to say welcome and thanks to everybody that's joined us on the line. As you just heard, we'll be starting in just a moment or two. We have quite a few people logging into the session as we speak, so we'll wait just a moment here and then get started. Thanks again for taking the time to join us. Thanks so much, team. Let's get started.
Welcome. Thank you for joining our Enterprise Content Management Best Practice Series webinar. I am Jerry O'Driscoll, Vice President of USCM's Content Management Practice and host of your presentation today. Our featured speaker today is Daniel O'Connor, Chief Executive Officer of InfoCommerce. The discussion today will cover... Sorry, Daniel?
Go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah. Okay, Daniel? I'm just going to lead in here for a second. The discussion today will cover introductions, USCM at a glance, what are logistics, the value of SharePoint in a life science organization. My background is over 15 years of experience in enterprise software. Hey, Becky, can you take over there for a second? I've got an issue over here at my side here.
Absolutely, happy to. Sorry, team, we seem to be having some technical difficulties. What I would like to continue with just the basic introductions. And Jeff, if you could help me with advancing the slides, that'd be great. What I'd like you to know is that we just appreciate you joining our session today. And Jerry was about to introduce Daniel O'Connor. But first we'd like to tell you about Jerry. His background includes actually 15 years of experience in enterprise software and services delivery within the pharmaceuticals, biotech, CRO, and medical device industry. From 1997 to today, he's promoted the advantages of electronic systems over paper and throughout the content management realm, which is why he's an excellent fit for the USDM ECM practice lead. Daniel O'Connor, who's our featured speaker, brings extensive experience of Microsoft-based SharePoint solutions within life sciences. He's been working closely with SharePoint since 2003, and his company, Innovo Commerce, is the leading provider of SharePoint solutions for both content management and clinical portals, and his company's applications are used by over 50% of the world's largest pharmaceuticals in clinical environments. It's pretty impressive. I'll tell you a little bit about U.S. data management. USDM has been focused exclusively on the life sciences business needs since 1990, 99 actually. We're a market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory compliance professional service solutions in the regulated industry. We're headquartered in Ventura, California. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're the preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. We specialize in assisting clients with reducing regulatory risk while maximizing their investment in quality management systems, ECM, BCI, and IT infrastructure. Our directive overall for U.S. data management is to simplify, unify, and optimize compliance and business objectives. USDM now offers a compliance services with Innovo Commerce, for their SharePoint Innovo Points applications. I want to let you know the logistics for today. Our content will be covered in about 30 minutes, and then you can interact with our team on the iLink message board. On the bottom left of your screen, now you'll be able to type in questions, and we will address them at the end. We're here just to facilitate discussion, share ideas, and explore solutions together. Thanks again for joining us, and now we'll turn the presentation over to Daniel.
Thank you. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to try to cram a lot of information into a very short time period, and the goal here is to share some of the experiences we've had, some best practices, and some tips based on our experience over the last few years, especially dealing with qualifying and validating SharePoint applications. Again, our group has a lot of experience in this area, both in the clinical side and actually on the document management and ERP areas and FDA regulated industry. The goals, first of all, I want to take a step back. What are the goals of drug development, drug developers, biopharmaceutical companies, medical device companies in implementing SharePoint? SharePoint is seen as a platform for business productivity, flexibility, and compliance. So we can potentially have an environment now where companies can deploy the technology for productive pursuits both in controlled areas and non-controlled, more collaborative areas. Economies of scale. Companies want to be able to pay once for a platform and utilize it for multiple business purposes. With common IT administrative support, common services, underlying support. The third area is enterprise integration and rationalization. So basically, again, maximizing a return on investment in Microsoft investments, as well as integrating and collaborating with integrating with other systems. Can everybody hear me okay?
Doing great, thank you.
Okay. So emergence of SharePoint as a standard platform for business collaboration. I just want to provide some context for everybody on the call. This is actually a year and a half old, almost 2 years old now. But what this shows you is the Gartner Magic Quadrant Enterprise Content Management Collaboration market. If you would have looked at this back in 2003, Microsoft would have been way on the left-hand bottom corner. But now you see Microsoft actually pulling ahead of EMC, which is Documentum, eRoom, IBM, Oracle, and that trend will continue with the SharePoint product at least. So it's emerged as a leading basic enterprise content management collaboration platform technology. Innovo Commerce had done a survey probably about a year and a half ago, actually, so it's a little bit dated, but we surveyed a lot of our contacts in top 20 pharma. Just some of the core findings, and I can share more information if there's follow-on questions for after this, but some of the key findings was that SharePoint is now an overwhelming standard for collaboration and team project sharing inside most of the top 20 pharma companies, which is a big change. If you would have looked 5-7 years ago, it wouldn't have been the case. SharePoint's also emerging as a serious platform for regulated document management, clinical portals, and other controlled applications. And it's still early days, but there's many companies now that have validated SharePoint applications. It's becoming more and more commonplace, and it's very good for the industry. And overall, it's providing an alternative to established ECM compliance vendors, which is good. Competition is good in this market. Just some of the trends that we've seen over the years. Back in 2003, SharePoint 03 was a basic portal technology primarily. With the emergence of SharePoint 2007, you started to see, more intensive intranet, extranet team collaboration. And with also starting around 2008 and beyond, regulated document management instances and clinical and other types of validated portals. Okay, so just at a high level, what triggers compliance interest with SharePoint deployments? And it's interesting. I'll get into FDA in a second, but we're seeing some other areas. I've been very involved with SharePoint compliance initiatives. E-discovery, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure changed in 2006, which is around records management, and SharePoint has, big companies have lots of SharePoint content and actually records buried in that content. So there's an interest in that. Sarbanes-Oxley, ISO 9000, some of the other ISOs. Of course, Part 11 compliance, so electronic signatures and security around document control for areas in R&D and quality and such. And there's some other areas as well. So the next point is SharePoint. Does it contain all the features necessary to facilitate FDA 21 CFR Part 11? That's an important topic I want to go into. SharePoint 2007, the answer, first of all, is no. It does not. It's a platform, and so you have to do work to facilitate that compliance, whether you build it yourself or whether you buy a third-party product. But in 07, it required more work, and I won't go into every one of these line items, but in a nutshell, things like electronic signature, workflow, lifecycle, state management, a series of areas, PDF rendition, it required additional work to augment SharePoint to have a solution that would facilitate FDA 21 CFR Part 11. And a few companies emerged to solve those problems, and there's emerging a pretty vibrant Microsoft ecosystem of third-party products to help you with that. Okay, and 07, so 07 was probably 40-50% of what you needed. Okay, SharePoint 2010 has had some significant advancements in areas such as metadata management, document sets. There's a series of things that are better in 2010. More granular retention policy management of content. It's still not there. You can't just buy SharePoint 2010, stand it up, qualify it, validate it, and say, okay, we're at 21 Part 11 compliant. You still need to facilitate electronic signatures. You still need workflow. Workflow in SharePoint 2010 is not sufficient. You'll have to develop in Windows Workflow Foundation or buy a third-party workflow tool and integrate it in and do that yourself, or buy a third-party product. But the SharePoint 2010 product is probably 70-80% there. And then what you have to do is either buy a product on top of that or buy a project on top of that. That's sort of what I call a productized project. But the important takeaway here is SharePoint is a powerful platform now to facilitate Part 11 compliance, but you have to extend it in the ways to meet those requirements, either through buying a third-party product or building it yourself with integrators. Okay. Quickly on build versus buy, for most companies, it doesn't make sense to build. Okay, it makes sense to find a vendor that that where there's chemistry and where you find they understand your needs and work with them to scope out your to look at your user requirements and find alignment with a vendor that way. However, there's some cases where companies will build, particularly bigger companies that may have specific needs and the right expertise and the right capital. We've seen that happen, and in some cases it's been very successful. In other cases it hasn't. So it really depends on a number of things, but of course requirements, understanding the requirements and understanding what the technology can and cannot do is very important. So in a nutshell, if you want a controlled application in SharePoint, more than likely the recommendation is you buy a product, okay? But there are some cases where you actually build internally. Okay, so I won't go through this. SharePoint qualification and validation considerations. Okay, now first of all, what we're going to talk about now is 3 different scenarios we've seen with SharePoint. A SharePoint farm is the largest administrative unit of a SharePoint environment with the servers and supporting software. A single farm is one SharePoint farm with multiple applications. That's where we have one SharePoint farm with controlled applications in it and non-controlled applications like intranet, extranet, project team sites, things of that nature. In this case, we have controlled applications in the SharePoint farm are validated. The SharePoint farm is maintained in a qualified state, and we have SharePoint. There's non-controlled app capability in there like intranet, extranet, and then there's effective change control procedures to enforce compliance. Another scenario we've seen is where you have SharePoint separate farms for controlled and non-controlled applications. And then one we've seen as well is bigger companies may have separate SharePoint farms for each controlled application. But the challenge with that is that gets very expensive. Today we're going to focus on the economical path, the single mixed-use farm. So this is relevant regardless of scenario because we want to highlight and educate everybody today about the importance of qualifying your SharePoint environment no matter what you do. A single farm with multiple applications, again, includes controlled and non-controlled applications. Controlled applications in SharePoint are validated. The SharePoint farm is maintained in a qualified state, and we have change control to maintain it. The benefits of this mixed-use farm, especially for the small to mid-sized biotech or medical device company, is economics, simplicity, integration, and the same basic governance principles apply to a non-compliant farm regardless. So the basic governance model for something like this is you have a qualified infrastructure, and we're going to go into that in a second. You cordon off your validated apps within your SharePoint farm, your mixed farm. So you may have a custom application, or you may have a commercial off-the-shelf product for your SOP management. Whatever it is, you're validating those. You're cordoning those off, and they're validated. On the other side, you have your out-of-the-box SharePoint functionality just for collaboration and productivity and information sharing. And we apply risk-based principles to all of this. So there's no real risk in the top right-hand side. So we just baseline govern those, but you don't need to validate those, okay? And then we tightly govern. We don't need to validate, but tightly govern non-validated corporate applications. It might be an ERP connection. It might be a workflow for finance, something like that. Okay, so moving along here, the qualification of mixed-use farm. Here again, this is redundant. SharePoint-based qualification. Here, there's some steps. We have the templates. We've done this over and over and over, and you can do this yourself. It's not rocket science. It's just a matter of bringing the discipline into the SharePoint environment now, bringing IT, quality, and some of the business together to do this. One, you need to develop a complete reference architecture and configuration documentation. So there's different reference architecture types for a small farm, medium, or high farm. Medium is up to about 10,000 users. Okay, so medium farm can meet most of the smaller companies' needs. If you're a giant company, you're going to have enterprise large farms. But you come up with a reference architecture and configuration documentation. That's very, very important. It's not that hard to do if you have the right people doing it, okay? So it doesn't have to be that expensive or that long of a process. Next, you build the infrastructure to match the architecture following your own internal IT and quality procedures and standards. Okay, so you get your reference architecture, your documentation, then you build it up, or have someone else build it up for you in the data center. Either way, it's all possible, and it can happen fairly expeditiously. Third, confirm your build against architecture documentation and configuration specification. This is the formal documented qualification. Fourth, we produce any additional documentation to test, qualify certain additional aspects of the infrastructure, so things like disaster recovery, failover, and we have a lot of experience with that, particularly in the disaster recovery area. We then move into install and manage SharePoint. What we typically do is install and manage SharePoint Farm baseline change control solutions. So we have automated ways to automate the management of the configuration management of the SharePoint infrastructure. So we want to know if something's changed in the configuration of that SharePoint environment, that we track it so we can maintain it in a compliant state for qualification purposes. And now, after that, the environment is now qualified and is ready to have specific software installed, configured, and validated. This is the key right here. You don't validate SharePoint. You qualify SharePoint so that you can then install validated applications, or you can install applications that are going to need to be validated. So one of the key takeaways from this is just this checklist here. Make sure that this is instilled inside of your approach to managing SharePoint, and you're going to be in a much better shape than a lot of other people that haven't taken this into account. We know of companies that have installed controlled SharePoint applications that never bothered to qualify SharePoint, believe it or not, and because they were told, hey, we can just by buying this product, everything's validated, and including your underlying farm, which includes not only SharePoint but SQL Server, Windows Server, all the change control that has to happen there. Here's an example of one of our mid-sized reference architectures, just to give you some perspective. So we do this all the time, but there's people in your companies that can do this as well. What this is, that name of company is just our data center. But the idea is here is that we create these reference architecture documents, then we develop a configuration document based on this, and that's what guides our installation of the actual SharePoint farm. Okay, everybody hear me okay? Rebecca?
Doing fine, thank you.
Okay, sure. Moving right along here, we have then the SharePoint-based. So what I want to give you now is a document checklist that you always have to do in the SharePoint deployment. So one is the installation documents. As I mentioned, the reference architecture, and I just showed you an example of that. Next is the system configuration specification, which is drafted based on that reference architecture. Next is the qualification plan, followed by the application configuration specification, our installation guides, the IQ protocol, and the qualification report. Okay. Thereafter, we have implementation document deliverables when we're talking about actually a validated system that's going into that qualified program. And here we have, again, URS, user requirement specification, technical risk analysis, and all of our risk analyses are driven by GAMP5 risk-based principles, which is widely accepted nowadays. Our client application configuration specification, user manual, user training manual, and validation plan, and the rest. And it's very important when you work with an actual vendor that they provide all of this guidance and this approach, guidance around this approach, and the actual artifacts, document templates. Or if you build it yourself, you actually you put these together yourself with your internal quality group. Okay. All right. Continuing, there's a few other here: the disaster recovery test plans, disaster recovery test cases, and disaster recovery test report. Okay, then we move into vendor documents. So these are the documents the vendor actually has to have. Okay, the other ones where the vendor will guide you because they will understand how they fit into the context of a controlled SharePoint application. But here, the vendors are going to need to have their product requirements, functional design specs, all the things that a lot of the folks on this call are used to, but also unit testing, integration testing, test plans, test scripts, test results, test summary report, installation guide, release notes, and administration guide. So, again, first you qualify that SharePoint environment yourself, or working, with a company like US Data Management, or your own internal consultants, or your own internal employees, if the expertise is there. Once you have that SharePoint environment qualified, you then are going to be shopping for certain applications that are going to help you leverage SharePoint to manage controlled information, like an SOP management system or a clinical portal, whatever it is. Okay, that's if you do work with a vendor, you're going to want to have these documents in place with that vendor. Okay, moving along here, we recommend often a workshop. So basically a risk assessment workshop for your SharePoint farm, so that you can move to qualify that farm, even before you actually are purchasing any third-party tools for controlled applications and facilitation, for example, of Part 11 compliance. So because what we found is a lot of companies already have SharePoint farms in place, and they may have done things to that farm, and we want to understand what they've done so that we can retroactively qualify it. That we've seen that a number of times now, okay? Because it's expensive to scratch everything and start anew, buy more equipment. It's not feasible for most companies. So a workshop's a good way to start, and you can do this yourselves. I mean, you can organize this, and what we recommend is typically you identify business drivers to deploy SharePoint for controlled, validated activities. So you have your SharePoint farm, but you in this workshop, with this working group, you'll identify where you want to use SharePoint for controlled activities. Okay, so it's sort of a roadmap for the future. You create an IT and QA and key business representative stakeholder committee to work together to drive this thing. And the reason you do that is because typically in many Microsoft SharePoint environments, it's run by IT, and that's great, but again, there isn't necessarily the awareness, consciousness of how this technology is going to be have a mission critical impact on some of your compliance issues and standards. So you need to include your QA and representative of business. Typically develop a survey questionnaire to understand how you're using your existing SharePoint environment, if you are, and we've done this before, so we have some templates we can share in the future. But the idea is, how many SharePoint farms do you have, if any, a detailed list of configurations to your environment, a detailed list of any customizations to your environment, and a breakdown of business owners, general use cases, and projection of future demand for or where you want to go with this SharePoint environment from a business perspective. And what we typically do there is apply our risk matrix, and we have technical risk, business risk, and regulatory risk to what you've already done to your SharePoint farm, so that we can retroactively qualify it if you want it qualified and if you already have your SharePoint environment. Now, if you don't have a SharePoint environment, or you want to stand up a brand new one, that's a much easier situation. We developed that reference architecture I showed you based on your business drivers, your projected use cases for SharePoint itself. You then, again, develop SharePoint risk matrix, and again, there's templates out there for regulatory risk, business risk, technology risk. Based on that, you formulate a risk mitigation strategy. You put together, again, you go into that qualification. In the case, if you already have a SharePoint farm, you retroactively qualify it. If you're standing up a new one, you go through the checklist I showed earlier, and you implement operating procedures and change management to maintain it in a qualified state. And again, we recommend using tools that can automate the tracking of what's changed within a SharePoint farm environment, so the configurations at the SQL Server and SharePoint application server level. So with that's a lot of information I tried to include in a very short period of time. I basically had 20 minutes to put this together, or to present a lot of information. We could go deeper into a lot of areas, but hopefully that this was helpful and at least provides an overview of at least how some people are trying to, leverage SharePoint out there for, productivity, greater efficiency, and compliance. So with that, if there's any questions or comments or critiques, open.
Thank you, Daniel. We really appreciate you taking the time to share such wonderful information. And yes, we do have questions. The first one is from Joe, asking, how long does it take to qualify SharePoint?
That's a great question. With a new environment, if you don't have any legacy SharePoint infrastructure, or you want to just stand up a new environment, it can happen pretty quickly. I mean, we can generate, I showed you the checklist, we can generate the reference architecture, in a matter of a couple days to a week. We can go through the entire process probably in 4 weeks. So it can go anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of months, depending upon the complexity and how quickly the client can review documentation and approve it and so forth. So anywhere from a few weeks to a few months, but it can be done in a few weeks.
Terrific. Thank you. Frank is asking the question, what are the benefits of qualifying SharePoint before we decide to purchase a controlled application?
Great question. That is really, we recommend it because it gives you, first of all, SharePoint is like any other application like Lotus before it. It can quickly get out of control if you don't have governance principles driving how you use it. So we find that the qualification process is a wonderful way to introduce governance into your SharePoint environment. SharePoint is now becoming a mission-critical application for globally distributed companies. Companies are global. They have teams all over the world, and SharePoint is a collaboration technology, among other things. So you want to be able to govern it and maintain it in a controlled state. So even if you never purchase a validated system, a system that needs to be validated, we still recommend qualifying it because it's a mission critical part of your business now, and you want to make sure that it's controlled, that it's maintained in a qualified state, that you just don't do things to it that can affect its performance or make it such that it becomes unwieldy. Okay.
Terrific. Thank you. We have a question from Eric. Have you worked with integrating SharePoint and TrackWise?
I haven't. That's a great question. I have not personally. TrackWise is a great product. I mean, it can be a little difficult for users, but it's one of the top quality training programs out there. Just about every big pharmaceutical company has it. I have seen some tidbits out there, I think in blogs, that there may be some rumblings about integrating these two systems. But, essentially there's some vendors that are SharePoint vendors that are, marketing alternatives to TrackWise, but they may not have the same depth of functionality and capability that TrackWise has. So I think that if you have TrackWise and you're used to that functionality, but you want to maybe make it available via a SharePoint front end, that's very possible to do. SharePoint was designed for that, really. So it's very feasible to integrate it. I haven't read of any specific case studies, however.
Thank you, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Brittany is asking if we could offer ideas or thoughts around how SharePoint compares to Documentum.
Well, that's a great one. I mean, there's different layers to that question, Brittany. That's a great question. I mean, SharePoint is not Documentum. Documentum is it's a different technology. But SharePoint, we are seeing. In fact, we're involved with replacement strategies of SharePoint for Documentum. Documentum is a heavy-duty content management, controlled platform that was built for more rigorous, controlled document management. SharePoint is much more of an open platform. Okay, you can use it for activities that you typically would do in Documentum. However, you can also use it for different things like an intranet or collaboration, and that's what's very appealing about SharePoint. Okay, very appealing. And if you qualify SharePoint, as we've recommended here, you can get a lot of bang for the buck. Whereas in Documentum, you really can't use Documentum for intranet You can buy their eRoom product for collaboration, but we're seeing a lot of people replacing that with SharePoint. Documentum is more hierarchical, so you can, through customization again, or for third-party product, again, you have to do the same thing to Documentum. You can get probably a richer hierarchy of integration. So, for example, from the standpoint of like quality management, if you have an SOP that is linked to 100 records, okay, and if an SOP changes, you want to be able to quickly link to 100 different underlying records. Documentum was architected to facilitate that more easily than SharePoint, but you can get that done with SharePoint 2010. You have to augment it. Documentum, however, you have to augment it as well. The other layer of comparison is, and a lot of this is I think industry kind of FUD, is scalability. The Documentum Oracle world will tell the big pharma customers, especially out there, that SharePoint SQL Server doesn't scale like Oracle Documentum does, and that's the reference architecture I showed you. You can establish a reference architecture that will help you scale SharePoint to over 200,000 users, and I've worked with companies that have over 200,000 SharePoint users. So it really is. They're different technologies. They both have strengths and weaknesses. Our point here, we obviously work a lot with SharePoint. We think that the strengths of the combined synergies that you can get with SharePoint far outweigh maybe some of the perceived weaknesses that it has, e.g. it's a little bit of a flatter technology, less hierarchical capability. But there's always a series of trade-offs, and if you look at Documentum in the industry, it's not going away. Big companies have it. They will continue to use it. Okay.
Terrific. Another question from Walter. What are your thoughts on a hosted side SharePoint versus on-premise solution in regards to IQ validation?
Well, I mean, we actually run hosted applications. I mean, it really, first of all, we find ourselves setting up hosted managed data center services because a lot of companies just don't have the capacity right now to set up their own SharePoint farms for specific purposes. So we find that it's potentially easier to do it in the hosted environment because there's sort of less process friction in terms of dealing with other maybe political environments on site within on premises. One thing that comes up is things like Active Directory. It gets a little trickier if you have a hosted application and you want to leverage the Active Directory of the internal on premises Active Directory. So there's strategies around that where you can set up trust relationships so that you can leverage your internal Active Directory for external authentication. And of course then there's forms and claims-based authentication for external users coming in. You don't necessarily use Active Directory for that. So there's a series of considerations. It'd be tough to, it depends on what the business needs are, okay? So some companies need their SharePoint application installed. They're integrating with some other mission-critical systems, and it's easier to get that done when it's installed on premises for a variety of reasons. But there's pros and cons to both approach, and your business goals and objectives are ultimately what are going to drive the decision.
Thank you, Daniel. A two-part question from Ishta. Wanting to know if you're free to give an example of a large company, 10,000 or more users, that has validated SharePoint 2010, and also do you have tips or guidance on handling change management for a company that size? His company has been using SharePoint 2007 for about 3 years, and they're validating the current environment means they will have to re-communicate and re-guide users on content and records management, which is huge for 10,000 users. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one to answer. And I mean, first of all, we can't talk about any companies per se, but there are companies that have major validated applications. Okay, and in one company I know of personally, there's over 20,000. Now, this is a tricky question to ask. I mean, I think you have to go back to, it's like any other system, right, that's going to be validated. I mean, you've got to have your qualification in place. You have to have your policies and procedures in place for that system, and you have to have the training in place so that the revised system is set up and that the users, based on roles or groups, understand, what they can and cannot do in the context of this system. And so that goes with any system, whether it's a Microsoft-based system or Oracle or SAP. So a lot of it comes down to being well organized, having your qualification in place, your change control, your policies and procedures, your training, and being organized to facilitate that. So it's not. It sounds like you're going from 2007 to 2010, and you're going to go into a validated 2010. I think that was the question, and I think you mentioned records management as well, which is a whole nother can of worms, because records management really isn't a technology problem as much as it is a people, organizational, and policy problem. So I don't know if I can do justice to that question. It's a great, complicated question. Maybe we can have a follow-on series of questions that we can answer for the group and dive into those in more detail.
Absolutely. I'll take a few more questions here. But so any of you, if you have a confidential-based questions or things that you'd like us to follow up and share more detail, you're welcome to send me an email. It's rmelody, M-E-L-E-D-Y, at usdatamanagement.com, and I can then circle back with Daniel and Jerry and get appropriate answers for you. Meanwhile, next question will take us from Annika. Says that they are looking to implement a documentation management and CAPA software program. Can a validated SharePoint system fulfill these needs?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, if you want document control and really basic CAPA management, there are SharePoint solutions that can help you do that. It all comes back to, first, it all comes back down to your user requirements and generating those user requirements, and then talking to a few vendors out there and mapping those user requirements to their functional their functional specification documents. What the technology can actually do and how it can be configured to meet your user requirements. Absolutely.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Great. Next question from Jeff. Can SharePoint be integrated with Dynamics AX?
Yeah, I mean, Dynamics AX is one of Microsoft's ERP. They bought a couple different mid-market ERP companies, and they've consolidated it into the Dynamics brand. And we personally been involved with integrating SharePoint with Oracle ERP system, a pretty comprehensive integration. So absolutely. SharePoint's designed to do those types of things where you potentially want to access information that's in an ERP system and potentially present it as web parts or as a dashboard in a broader portal view, for example. What we did was it was a supplier portal for a medical device company, and we connected Oracle with SharePoint. And so yeah, it's designed for those types of things. It's a system integration project. You need to understand what your business drivers are, your requirements, find a vendor that can meet those needs, that understands what your requirements are, and then structure it accordingly.
Thank you, Daniel. Eric is asking, if you currently have SharePoint, does retroactive qualification take longer?
Yes.
Okay.
There's just more
Short
work,
and sweet
right?
answer there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but you can remember. I gave you the workshop steps, so you can do a lot of that yourself. Put together that survey of what's in there, and that will help you identify the complexity of retroactively qualifying it. So, but it will take longer.
Terrific. We'll take one last question here from Zan, wanting to know what is the difference between validating SharePoint and qualifying SharePoint?
Well, again, you don't validate SharePoint. As I mentioned, I provided a checklist. Can I still use this? Can everybody see this? Let me go back here. This is qualifying SharePoint. Everybody see this slide. This is qualifying SharePoint. This is not validating SharePoint. So validating, you don't validate SharePoint. You qualify SharePoint's a platform. It's an environment that you're going to introduce applications, okay, or use out of the box or customize. But you validate the controlled activity that's happening in SharePoint. So a great example would be, again, SOP management or Kappa type system. You validate that. And typically it's a third-party product that you buy, you install it, and then you validate that on top of this already qualified SharePoint environment. And I hope that, so we don't validate SharePoint at all. We qualify SharePoint, and these are the steps to qualify SharePoint.
Tremendous. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you again for joining us for such a tremendous presentation. Truly appreciate your energy in sharing all of this information. I would like to encourage all of you to continue participating in a discussion. If you come up with questions after the fact, we would welcome you to post them out on our LinkedIn site. We'll have a discussion started specifically around this presentation, or again, if they're of a confidential nature, feel free to send them over to me at rmelody, M-E-L-E-D-Y, at usdatamanagement.com. And you're certain at this point all familiar with our website. It's usdatamanagement.com, and you can see the recorded link for this presentation will be up probably within 24 hours, and you can also take a look at the other presentations that are on our future schedule. You can just click on the webinars tab and you'll see the upcoming agendas there. If you have suggestions for topics that would be useful for you and your teams, we'd be happy to hear that as well. And always welcome to feedback. I'm looking for ways to improve our presentations and our outreach there. I just appreciate you all joining us, and we look forward to more opportunities to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.